Hello, dear students. I am Kurbanova Nodar Razakovna. It is American literature class now. Our today's lecture is devoted to the literature of the lost generation. And today we will speak about some peculiarities of literature of the lost generation and about life and literary activity of Sherwood Anderson, Francis Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway. The lost generation, or the generation that came of age during World War I. The term was popularized by Ernest Hemingway, who used it as one of two contrasting epigraphs for his novel The Sun Also Rises. The lost generation refers to a group of writers and artists who grew up during the First World War. Here we can see some representatives of the literature of lost generation, the Ernest Hemingway, Francis Scott Fitzgerald, and Sherwood Anderson. These writers were from the United States, but most of them moved to Paris, where they started a new literary movement that captured the spirit of the times. The term lost generations come from something Gertrude Stein had overheard being said to a car mechanic. That is what you are. That's what you all are. All of you young people who served in the war, you are a lost generation. After experiencing the horrors of the First World War, watching the government ignore their veterans, witnessing the job market change due to an influx of immigrants, and seeing the previous generation start to push for prohibition, they became distrustful of authority and government. Here are given some characteristics of lost generation literature. The idea of finding one's own way in life and making one's own mark on the world, individualism, decadence and debauchery, hedonistic lifestyles, disillusionment with the world, and cynical attitudes. Let me continue just with the characteristics of lost generation literature. The moral loss, aimlessness, and a loss of romance due to realism or cynicism. So let me speak about Sherwood Anderson's life and literary activity. So on September 13, 1876, Sherwood Anderson was born in Camden, Ohio. He was the third child in the family. Then the family settled permanently in Clyde, Ohio in 1884. The income was rarely adequate without the added help of the children's income. Due to the difficulties, Anderson's father began drinking heavily and his mother died in 1895. Sherwood was eager to take on odd jobs and earn this name Joby. However, his interests caused him to miss school often. He finally left high school before graduating. In 1896, Anderson left Clyde for Chicago, where his brother Carl was living. In September of 1900, Anderson attended the Wittenberg Academy. Earning his food and lodging as a chore boy at the artist's boarding house, Anderson encountered a highly cultured environment. Ironically, the influence of the artist was most important to Anderson was for his advance in the business world. The cruel advertising manager secured him a job in Chicago as a copywriter. He was highly successful in his position. In 1904, he married Cornelia Lane, the daughter of a wealthy Ohio wholesaler. He left Chicago for Northern Ohio in 1806, and over the next 6 years, he managed a mail-order business in Cleveland and then two paint manufacturing firms. Yet, Anderson increasingly spent his free time writing. On November 27, 1912, he disappeared from his office and was found 4 days later in Cleveland, disheveled and disoriented, having suffered a mental breakdown. In later writings, Anderson often referred to his episode as a conscious break from his materialistic existence, and many younger writers picked up on this, praising his heroic spirit. In 1914, he divorced Cornelia and married Tennessee Mitchell. That same year, his first novel was published, entitled Windy McPherson's Son. Along with his second Marching Man of 1917, he later commented that his first novels were raw and immature. He moved from job to job until he divorced his first wife. So he produced 7 notable works at the top of his writing career. After producing these works, Anderson divorced 2 more wives and finally found his wife until death. His later novels were about labor conditions in the South, and Sherwood Anderson died in 1941. And let's speak about some famous works. So he's best known for his classic collection of tales, Ryannsburg, Ohio. He began writing it in 1915 and generally wrote and the order the stories appear in the text. The book was published in 1919 and received much acclaim, establishing him as a talented modern American author. Let me speak about some of his works, such as The Book of the Grotesque, Adventure, Hands, and Loneliness. The Book of the Grotesque contains the lifeblood of many of Anderson's short stories. So Anderson's main goal is to destroy the walls between human beings. So in the work Adventure, Alice Hinman severely limits herself to herself because of a past heartbreak. She reserves herself for her former love only, therefore forming a chasm between herself and the outside world. So his work Hands, Wim Wendelboom lets his past dictate his future. He has introverted himself because he is afraid of the consequences of remaining open to other people. And in his work Loneliness, Enoch Robinson embodies the loneliness that Anderson focuses on. Robinson actually creates a separate world for himself, alienating himself from the rest of the world. Let's make a conclusion. So one major theme underscores all of Anderson's notable works, loneliness. So the main theme of his works is loneliness. Anderson stresses the fact that human beings are responsible for their own loneliness, and that humans may break down the barriers of loneliness if they only recognize that they are trapping themselves. One of the representatives of literature of lost generation is the most famous writer of American literature is Francis Scott Fitzgerald. Let's speak about his life and literary activity. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald's life resembles a fairy tale. So he was born on September 24, 1896. He was from upper middle class Irish Catholic family. He attended Northern Academy in Buffalo. So he attended St. Paul Academy from 1908 till 1911. Here he published his first story. So after graduating, he attended Newman School, a prep school in Hackensack. In 1913, he entered Princeton, wrote for scripts and lyrics for the Princeton Triangle Club and articles for the Princeton Tiger and Nassau Literary Magazine. He dropped out and joined the U.S. Army in 1917. So let's speak about his soldier days. He commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry. Convinced he would die, he quickly wrote his first novel, The Romantic Egoist. Assigned to Camp Sheridan in Alabama, where he met Zelda Sayer. The war ended before he was shipped overseas. Scott and Zelda Sayer began an intense romance in 1918. Scott went to New York to make his fortune so they could be married. Zelda was unwilling to wait or live on his small salary, so she broke the engagement in 1919. So heartbroken, he quit his job and moved back to St. Paul's to write. In St. Paul, he reworked his first novel, The Romantic Egoist, into the side paradise, the story of written essential Lost Generation, used Amory Blaine. The novel was accepted by screeners and would be published early in 1920. Between the acceptance and publication of This Side of Paradise, he wrote short stories for magazines. This Side of Paradise published March 26, 1920, rocketing Scott to instant fame. He and Zelda Sayer were married a week later. Zelda and Scott were celebrities, known for their extravagant lifestyle. The first and only child, Francis Scott, Scotty, was born in October 1921. His second novel, The Beautiful and the Damned, was published in 1922. Scott regularly went into debt and continued to write short stories to keep up with their lifestyle. In 1924, the Fitzgeralds moved to France and traveled Europe, where he wrote The Great Gatsby. So, The Great Gatsby was written in 1925, a brilliantly written, economically structured story about the American dream of the self-made man. The protagonist, the mysterious Jay Gatsby, discovers the devastating cost of success in terms of personal fulfillment and love. The family returned to America in late 1926. Scott had considerable trouble with his fourth novel. Zelda began to exhibit strange behavior in 1929 and suffered a schizophrenic breakdown in Europe. 1930, Scott wrote short stories to pay the bills for her treatment. They returned to America late in 1931, but in 1932 Zelda relapsed and was checked into Johns Hopkins Hospital. Other fine works include Tender in the Night, which was written in 1934 about a young psychiatrist whose life is doomed by his marriage to an unstable woman. Fitzgerald called this period of his life the crack-up. By 1936, he was having health problems and deep in debt. He couldn't sell stories and went to Hollywood alone to find work. He received little acclaim, but he did make enough money to get out of debt. Scott fell in love with columnist Shelley Graham in 1937. They remained together until his death. Patsy Bills, writing scripts and short stories for Esquire, died halfway through his final novel The Last Acorn on December 21, 1940. I was sure he heard was a failure and would go unremembered. So, I want to write something new, something extraordinary and beautiful and simple and intricately patterned. It's from a letter to his editor in July 1922. Francis Scott Fitzgerald fell into obscurity through the 40s and early 50s. The Great Gatsby was republished in 1953 and gained wider readership and acceptance. In the 1960s, Fitzgerald revival began. Scholars began studying his works in earnest again. Scott is now considered one of the permanent authors of the 20th century American literature. Ernest Hemingway is also one of the representatives of the literature of lost generation. There is nothing more difficult than to write a simple, honest story about a man, Hemingway said. First, you must know what you are writing about, and then you must learn to express it in writing. It takes a whole lifetime to do these two things. Ernest Hemingway, born into a strict Protestant family, was famous and well-accomplished author. He wrote 49 short stories and over 10 novels. He was a winner of Nobel Peace Prize. He was an avid hunter and fisher. He is considered the hero of World War I. He committed suicide in Idaho in 1961. He used the experiences of his life to create literary masterpieces during the modernism era. So Ernest Miller Hemingway was born on July 21st, 1899. He grew up in Oak Park, Illinois, upper middle class. His father was a doctor and mother was a singer. He had 4 sisters and a brother. The community had a large Protestant population. Hemingway wrote about his community, white lawns and narrow minds. Enjoyed hunting and fishing with his father when his mother wasn't introducing him to music and literature. Let's continue to speak about Hemingway's personal life. Rumored that his mother often dressed him in female clothes. Worked as a reporter for the Kansas City Star. World War I ambulance driver. It means in 1918 he was an ambulance driver. Celebrated as a war hero upon his return home. He was a reporter for Toronto Star in 1920. He married Hadley Richardson and moved to Paris in 1921. Father committed suicide in 1929, but Ernest Hemingway does the same in 1961, unfortunately, in Idaho. Hemingway wrote 49 short stories and published 6 best-selling novels, such as The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Old Man and the Sea, To Have and Have Not, A Movable Feast. The first big novel, The Sun Also Rises, was published in 1926. The heroes are people of the lost generation. They had nothing in the past and nothing will have in the future. They had speaking about their feelings. So stories of their sufferings conceal their real inner world under the mask of indifference. They drink to forget the emptiness that is around them. When the heroes speak, you feel something hidden beyond the outspoken words. And all these peculiarities of Hemingway's dialects are aimed at concealing the thoughts of the heroes. The theme of lost generation is also found in his next novel, A Farewell to Arms, which was written in 1929. This novel is about birth and death of a great human feeling. 2 themes are intermingled in this novel: the theme of love, which dies, and the theme of war, which shows sufferings. The second theme is rather serious. Hemingway not only shows the results of war, but condemns it. Here we feel the growing protest against the war. In the novel, the characters are masterly shown, as well as in his The Sun Also Rises, but with a few faults. It is but this novel which paves the new parts in the life of the acknowledged writer. And his next 2 essays, Death in the Afternoon, which was written in 1932, and Green Hills of Africa, which was written in 1935, were felt crisis in his work. But the following works, written in 1936, The Shows of Kilimanjaro and The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber, he sharply criticized the rare representatives of the American high class, the role of money in the behavior of the heroes. So, in this To Have and Have Not, the author divides the whole world into 2 parts: the world of the rich and the world of the poor, and brilliantly shows the conflict between them. At the end of the novel, the dying hero concludes, the man can't be alone. It is impossible how to be alone. So here the writer's humanism calls the poor to unite for the sake of future. And the fifth column, Hemingway shows the struggle for Madrid. The novel For Him the Bell Tolls describes the struggle of Spanish guerrillas in the fascist rear. From one side, the novel reflects the growing literary talent of the author, but from the other side, the contradictions of the writer which had already begun in the 30s. The novel was finished after the defeat of the Spanish Revolution, so the main character, Robert Jordan, dies without belief in the struggle for which he died. The deep contradictions of the novel are openly accepted by the author himself. The crisis which is felt in this novel lasted for a long time. He could not return to great themes in the writing. During the World War II, he wrote Man at War, which was written in 1942, and only in 1950 he published Across the River and Into the Trees, but nothing new is found in his novel. Even some episodes remind the Farewell to Arms. His real triumph and his next work, The Old Man and the Sea, which was written in 1952, it is a story full of humanism, a story about courageous people. The main idea of the work is that a man can be killed but not defeated. It is his last published work. This work will always be expression of his love to common people. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954 for his mastery of the art of modern narration. The books of the big man, as is called in Cuba, of a courageous fighter, traveler, life lover, will be ever remembered by people. So popular characters in Hemingway's works, mostly they are soldiers, hunters, bullfighters, and primitive people. The themes of his work, courageous and honest people losing hope in a modern, hectic society. So possibly reflects his own outlook concerning his place in the world. His writing is very dry and descriptive with little plot, draws heavily from past experience. His alcoholism and depression contributed to his eventual suicide. And unfortunately in 1961 he shot himself in Ketchum, Idaho. So Hemingway studied people and life all over our planet. He always looked for events in which all the beauty or everything bad in a man can be seen. Hemingway had his own way of writing. His stories seem very simple in composition. Often there are very few events, but we feel that there is very much behind the events that he describes, that the whole life of the character leads to this event. Here we can see Hemingway's Tomb and Ketchum, Idaho. So, dear students, today's lecture was devoted to the writers who participated in the First World War and reflected in their works the spirit and mode of life of the lost generation, a generation which was a witness and is a participant of that war. We have given a brief outline of life and work of Sherwood Anderson, Francis Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway. Dear students, thank you for your attention.